Inflation in two different worlds. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ainslie Insights, brought to you by Ainslie Bullion, Ainslie Crypto, and the Gold and Silver Standard as the Ainslie Group celebrates 50 years. Today, we welcome back Alex, who's been looking at the latest US inflation numbers overnight on the back of the Australian numbers that she told us about last week and where they leave us in terms of the local and the international picture. How are you going today, Alex?
I am going well. How are you, Chris?
I'm good. I found this interesting again. Like you talked last week about the Australian numbers, this week specifically about the US numbers. Do you want to maybe start us off, probably tell us what those numbers were, but also do you think the different inflation rates in the US and Australia can be attributed to different factors happening in each country? What's going on there?
Yeah, so we all know that, and we've spoken about this before, that with all the fiscal stimulus that came in during COVID, and specifically now has continued through the US, they have pushed basically their inflation onto the rest of the world.
Hmm.
Now, they've been able to do that because they're the reserve currency. So everyone needs US dollars to trade. So as their dollar strengthened, as their interest rates strengthened, the Aussie dollar or other currencies fell and created more inflation within other countries. So you've had the US fiscal stimulus driving inflation worldwide. Today's article is basically about two different types of inflation. One is called demand pull, and the other is supply push. So they're two different types of inflation. And reserve banks around the world are tackling both of these the same way through monetary policy. What's interesting is who's got the most demand push and who's got most supply pull, and how monetary policy actually works in dealing with it. So the US inflation numbers, so the US specifically has demand pull inflation. So their numbers came in, there was an expectation of about 3.1% CPI last night, came in at 3.2. So everyone's now, proposing that we're either higher, longer in rates, or rates still need to go up in the US. Whereas in Australia, we had an expected 3.5% CPI and it came off at 3.4. Now, the interesting thing about Australia is probably most of the inflation left over right now is either from supply push shocks or actually from the monetary decisions that have been made by the RBA.
So just to make that really clear for people who might not understand that terminology, it really isn't that complicated, is it? When you're saying demand pull, it's really about prices are being pulled up, if you like, because there's just too much demand in the market.
Because the
So
economy is great. Because the
that's right.
economy is great, everyone wants to buy something. That's demand pull.
And supply push, is that more of the type of inflation, like out of COVID, for example, we saw massive supply issues, which means that then that gets pushed further down the line. Is that
Yeah, so a supply shock can come from certain things like Ukraine war, what happened with the
yeah.
energy, COVID, the chip shortages and the transport delays when everyone was buying. So that COVID probably had a lot of both. And then even monopolies have supply push shocks, which is probably what we see from Coles and Woolworths at the moment, which
Yeah,
is
right.
what's been investigated. So they're different things. One is controlled through monetary policy and dampening something. So demand pull, let's get our labour rates down. Let's throw a bit more cost on these people who, with the economy going so well. Whereas a supply shock, well, it's a shock. It will go away. So throwing monetary policy over the top of a supply shock does nothing. In fact, the argument today that we're making is it actually makes things worse.
And that's such an important differentiation because you just highlighted, the US is going through one, Australia's going through a different one. Often we think the same policy response is necessary across the board, and there's subtlety there that does need to be taken into account. Do you think that maybe like the fiscal policies or the actual government spending policies of the US and Australia have contributed to what we're seeing happening here and overseas? And is that something that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, so the fiscal policies generally around the rest of the world have been tempering a bit. The US just seems to be ramping it up. So Biden's just announced his 2025 budget, which is looking at a $7.3 trillion spend, which is 1.7 trillion more than what they're going to earn. And that is in a booming economy. So this is like everything's going great over here. We're taxing people. I mean, so they say, everything's wonderful. So we're going to now run a $1.7 trillion deficit. They are just fueling this inflation, the demand pull inflation. Whereas countries like Australia and the UK and Europe, I mean, they've been tempering their spending. It's not as crazy as what's going on over there, but we are still subject to these supply shocks. So a lot of energy issues still in Europe. Australia has monopolies. There's a lot of supply shocks still coming through, and you're starting to see it now in the CPI figures coming out of Australia, where things that are part of the supply shocks, so cereals in particular and energy, are starting to come back off. So their CPI is dropping, where the things that were never affected by a supply shock, which is like clothes wasn't affected by the Ukraine supply shock, which is like clothes and manufactured furniture. I mean, they are all contributing negatively now to CPI. The thing that appears to be attributing the most now to CPI in Australia is actually because our rates are probably too high, because we do not have demand pull inflation. So the things that are contributing the most now are insurance, financial services, and housing costs. Now, they are all because our rates are set too high. And, housing costs, I mean, they're sitting at a 6+%, insurance 16%. A lot of that is driven from finance and from the cost of money. And that is now feeding into inflation in Australia.
That I don't think I've heard that explained anywhere any better than what you just did. That real difference when you look at those drivers, it becomes quite clear, particularly in the Australian context, where you go, yeah, here it doesn't make sense to raise rates to combat that inflation that we're seeing, because it's going to have the exact opposite effect of actually exacerbating the inflation when the inflation is due to factors that are supply driven. Like that makes a lot of sense.
So because the US is energy sufficient, even though we should be, but that's an argument for another day, they did not get the Ukraine supply shock. So their inflation is purely demand pull, which is why their numbers, I suspect now, are starting to creep up, whereas Australia is starting to creep down because the supply shocks in Australia are starting to come out. But likely still, we have set our interest rates wrong by following the US because the inflations were basically confused. One can be treated with monetary policy, the other you just have to wait it out.
Makes so much sense. So to wrap this up, and this leads into that question really nicely, what do you think is the ideal approach for central banks here? Because it seems like you're saying, first of all, if they need to be different, they need to take into consideration the actual underlying factors in the individual countries. But how do we deal with that if you're a central bank? Does the Australian Central Bank just need to ignore what's going on overseas and really stick to its own lane? Like, how do you see that?
You know what? It's one of those things that I don't think this sort of scenario has been seen forever. The US right now, like I said, because they lifted rates, they pushed inflation on. So it was purely their stimulus at some point that was pushing rates through to Australia in order to combat a dropping exchange rate, because your interest rates are set lower than other countries. Unfortunately, you have to lift interest rates. The problem right now is America is floating above this and still pushing more and more spending through. And it's gone too far for Australia, UK, Europe, all these other countries. They cannot lift. They need to drop, because that's what's driving a lot of our inflation. But what does that do for exchange rates going forward? The US is, doing $2 to $3 trillion a year in deficits. The debt has to be bought. Who's going to buy it? So just unless the US can temper down its deficit, it is either not going to be a reserve currency or it is going to crack the whole financial system. It is as simple as that, because it's pretty broken right now.
So on that cheery note, thank you for sort of going into that. I know last week, we really looked at that Australian angle. This week, the US angle, pulling them both together. It was really interesting to me to see the differences between the two. So I think we need to keep looking at that. I'm sure we will. We'll address some of those other topics in the weeks ahead, no doubt, as well. So thank you for your work as always, Alex.
Oh, thank you for having me again.
Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll chat again soon.